All right, welcome back to Human Extended. We like to take these deep dives into really interesting tech and like the way that technology is shaping how we live and think about ourselves. And today we're going somewhere really cool. We're diving into AI, but not just any AI. This is artificial intelligence that learns kind of like how our brains do.
Yeah. We're talking about getting away from needing huge data sets and all of that and exploring something completely different with machine learning.
It's pretty wild stuff, and a lot of it is centered around this Swedish startup called IntuiCell.
That's right, IntuiCell, spun off from Lund University back in 2020. And their goal is basically to build a digital nervous system. Like literally that's what they're trying to do for machines.
So you're talking about robots that can learn and adapt just from their experiences in real time, pretty much how we do.
Exactly. That's the idea. And to make things even more interesting, IntuiCell, led by CEO Victor Luthman, they actually have this robot dog named Luna.
Oh, I've seen pictures of Lina.
Yeah, so Luna is kind of their star, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
And Luna is a big part of how they're showing off what they can do. What we're really going to focus on today is how IntuiCell claims they can get machines like Luna to learn in real time. And what's super different is they're doing this without all the usual stuff, like pre-training the AI or using backpropagation.
Right. So no more needing those massive data centers full of servers crunching numbers for weeks on end.
Yeah, they're claiming it's a whole new way for machines to learn. And get this, it's directly inspired by how our brains work.
I mean, that makes sense. We're the best learners around, aren't we?
Well, at least biologically speaking, so there's definitely something to be said for using the brain as inspiration. And what makes this even more intriguing is that Victor Luthman, the CEO, he often talks about how their tech comes from 30 years of neuroscience research at Lund University. So we're not talking about some fly-by-night idea here. This has some serious scientific backing.
That's a deep well of knowledge to draw from. Okay, so for everyone listening, today we're going to break down these claims. We'll see what IntuiCell is saying, what evidence they've put forward, and we'll discuss what this could mean for the future of AI. Like, what if they actually pull this off? What happens then?
Huge implications. Yeah. Really, really huge.
Okay, let's jump into it. So, real-time learning without pre-training or backpropagation. I mean, that's a bold statement right off the bat. That sets them apart from pretty much everyone else in AI right now, doesn't it?
Definitely does. That's the heart of what they're doing. They're saying machines can learn in real time, just like you said, from experience. Just like humans and animals is the phrase they use. And this is completely different from how most AI works today.
Yeah, usually it's train the system on tons of data, use backpropagation to refine it, and then you pretty much have a static system. Like it's learned what it's learned, and that's kind of it.
Yeah, static. And in IntuiCell, they're going for something way more dynamic.
Way more like us.
Exactly.
And their CEO, Victor Luthman, has actually said, this is a quote, "There's no pre-training, no offline simulations, and no billion-dollar data center in the background, but there's a nervous system that allows the machine to learn." I mean, it doesn't get much clearer than that.
Nope. That's about as clear as it gets. And it really changes how we even think about building AI, if you think about it.
So how do they even do that? If it's not the traditional way, how are they getting machines to learn in real time?
Well, to achieve that real-time learning, what they're probably using are something called online learning algorithms.
Yeah.
These algorithms, they update how the machine works, its control system, constantly, all the time, based on what it's sensing and how it's interacting with the world. And on top of that, they've also talked about using local learning rules.
Local learning rules. Okay.
Yeah.
What's that about?
So that means changes are happening in very specific parts of their digital nervous system, rather than like a global error correction like backpropagation. Think of it this way. Backpropagation, it's like finding and fixing a problem by looking at the whole picture all at once. But local learning rules, it's more like fixing a problem bit by bit, focusing on the specific spot where it's happening.
So it's more like how if you get a cut on your hand, your body focuses on healing that specific spot. It doesn't restructure your entire body to fix the cut.
That's a great analogy. It's about making things more efficient and, honestly, more like how biological systems like our brains work. And actually, this concept of local learning isn't brand new.
I was just thinking that, like, I feel like I've heard of things like biologically inspired learning before in like academic research and things like that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There's a whole field of research looking into how to use what we know about biological learning and apply that to AI.
Yeah.
And things like Hebbian plasticity, you've probably heard of that, the whole neurons that fire together, wire together idea.
Yeah, I remember that from college.
So that's an example of a local learning rule. Those rules basically change the connections between artificial neurons, but only using information that's right there in that local area of the network. And what's interesting is that IntuiCell, they've actually published a research paper, it's a preprint, called A Foundational Theory for Decentralized Sensory Learning.
A foundational theory for decentralized sensory learning. That sounds like a pretty important paper if we're trying to understand how they do what they do. So what are they saying in that paper?
So this was back in 2025 when they put out this paper, and their argument is basically this. Individual neurons, they don't need a global error signal to learn. Like, they don't need to know about mistakes happening way over on the other side of the network.
So they're kind of like self-sufficient learners.
In a way, yes. They learn by trying to reduce their own unexpected sensory input. They use these little feedback loops that are just local to that one neuron. And Intel thinks that this local minimization, when you do this across a whole network of neurons, it's enough to drive learning for the entire system.
Interesting. So they're not trying to fix everything at once. They're letting each neuron kind of figure things out on its own.
Yeah, and that's very different from backpropagation, which is all about calculating error across the whole network and then adjusting everything to reduce that overall error. IntuCell's way is more like, hey, if each neuron takes care of itself and tries to minimize its own little errors, then the whole system will naturally learn.
Okay, so let's think about Luna, their robot dog. So how is it even possible for Luna to learn something like standing or walking without all of that pre-training, without the backpropagation? Like it's just interacting with the real world, and somehow it's supposed to figure out how to move.
Yeah, for really, really complex skills, it would be a massive challenge, no question about it. But for things like basic motor skills, those fundamental things, it might actually be possible. I mean, we already have things like reinforcement learning in AI that lets agents learn through trial and error, right?
Yeah.
But even that usually needs a lot of data, and sometimes it uses backpropagation behind the scenes.
Right.
What IntuiCell seems to be doing is taking inspiration from biology and creating a kind of reinforcement learning that's way more efficient. They call it brain-like RL. And the fact that Luna is learning by actually interacting with a real human trainer is important too.
Yeah, so it's not just running simulations or anything like that. It's in the real world. It's getting feedback from a person. That's got to play a role somehow.
Yeah, so the algorithm, it must be able to take that real-world feedback, maybe like encouragement, or maybe it's achieving some kind of sensory goal, and use that to improve how the robot behaves. It's a feedback loop, but in a very real, physical way.
So no backpropagation. But there are still these adjustments happening in the network. I'm trying to picture what that even looks like. Like, how are those connections changing if it's not backpropagation doing the work?
Well, they're not telling us all the details, but the implication is that they found ways to adjust those connections in the network using purely local mechanisms. And again, think about how an animal learns to move. Your spinal cord, your brain, they reinforce movements that work. They strengthen those connections.
Right. So it's not some big calculation happening across the whole network. It's happening right there at the level of the individual connections.
Exactly. And there's a lot of really interesting research in AI that's trying to do exactly this. Like, for example, there are models of something called central pattern generators. These are networks of neurons that generate rhythmic movements, and we see them all over in animal nervous systems.
So like the rhythmic movements of walking or swimming?
Yeah, and these models have shown that those movements can be learned just from pretty simple feedback mechanisms. No need for complex calculations across a whole network.
That's super interesting, but simulating a spinal cord or a simple network, that's one thing. Having a physical robot out there in the real world, dealing with all the messiness of reality, that's got to be a whole other level of difficulty, right?
Totally. And that's where IntuiCell brings in the idea of built-in structure. Think of it like the reflexes that a newborn animal has. Like a baby horse, a foal, they can often stand up and even walk pretty soon after they're born. They're not learning that from scratch. It's kind of built into their nervous system.
Oh, that makes sense. It's like they're already pre-wired to do certain things.
Exactly, and it seems like IntuiCell is doing something similar. They've mentioned replicating the core functionality of a spinal cord as like the first layer of their digital nervous system.
Hmm.
And in animals, the spinal cord, it's got those central pattern generators that I mentioned. It's got reflex arcs for balance. And by building that kind of functionality right into the software, Luna might actually already be biased towards certain leg movements or ways of controlling its posture. It doesn't have to figure those things out completely from scratch.
So it's like giving the AI a head start. It's still learning, but it's not starting from zero. Okay, so to kind of wrap up this idea of real-time learning without all the traditional stuff, it seems like it might actually be plausible, especially for basic motor skills. but it's likely relying on a very specific kind of initial architecture, the software, and these local plasticity rules that we talked about.
Yeah, and we still have a ton of questions like how fast can this learning happen? How far can it go? I mean, Luna standing up, that's awesome, but it's just one thing. It's just the first step, really.
Totally. Okay, so let's move on to this bigger picture of a digital nervous system. What does that even mean, and how does that tie into continuous autonomous learning? This is where things get really ambitious, I think.
This is where they're thinking really big. So when they say digital nervous system, what they're getting at is that their AI is structured much more like our brains than like a typical AI, those deep learning models that everyone's building. And one of the key things here is that they're really into recurrent neural networks.
Recurrent, right? So not feed forward. I remember the difference. With recurrent, the connections between those artificial neurons, they can go in any direction. It's like a big feedback loop.
Exactly. It's not just information flowing in one
Yeah.
direction. And that's how our brains work. There are connections going everywhere. And the idea is that this kind of network, it's much better at continuous learning, at adapting to new information, just like a real brain. And they've been pretty upfront about this, about how their approach is different from what most AI researchers are focused on.
Yeah, they've said that the traditional AI with the backpropagation and the fixed data sets, it just can't do continuous learning in the real world. It's too limited.
Hmm.
So they're trying to overcome that with these recurrent networks and with a learning algorithm that's inspired by, you guessed it, our brains.
Exactly.
And we actually see this playing out with Luna, right? Like when it's trying to stand up, it's not following some pre-programmed routine. It's actually learning from each time it falls.
Exactly. In their demos, you see Luna stumbling around, trying to stand up, and it keeps trying. They have safety tether, so it doesn't actually damage itself, but the tether doesn't help it balance. It's all the software, the digital nervous system. It's constantly changing, adapting based on what's happening.
So each fall, each little stumble, it's giving the system new information, and the system is using that to get better.
Right. It's figuring out how to stand in real time. And it doesn't even need to know anything about its own body beforehand. Like it's not given a model of its legs or anything like that. It just figures it out through experience.
That's so cool, but I can also see how this continuous learning thing, it could be really tricky. Like what about a system forgetting what it's already learned? Or what if it becomes unstable because it's constantly updating itself?
You're hitting on some of the biggest challenges in this whole field. If IntuiCell is going to make this work, they need to figure out how to prevent things like catastrophic forgetting, where the system learns something new and it just wipes out all the old stuff.
Yeah.
And they need to make sure that the constant updating doesn't make the system go haywire.
So it's like walking a tightrope.
Oh.
You want the system to be flexible and keep learning, but you also need it to be stable and reliable.
Yeah. And if their system is truly inspired by biological learning, it probably has mechanisms built in for things like memory consolidation or stability. Like in our brains, we have different regions that are specialized for different things. The cerebellum, for example, is really important for refining movements and keeping us balanced.
And we sleep, which seems to be important for consolidating memories.
Right, exactly. And it looks like IntuiCell is trying to build in this kind of modularity, too. They're taking a layered approach to creating this digital nervous system.
Yeah, they've talked about implementing the spinal cord, and now they're working on something they call the thalamocortex. I'm assuming that's analogous to the thalamus and the cortex in our brains.
Yeah, and those are involved in processing sensory information, making predictions about the world.
Which is a big part of how we learn, right? We're always predicting what's going to happen next, and when we're wrong, we update our understanding.
Yeah, and this aligns with a really important theory in neuroscience called predictive coding. The idea is that our brains are constantly making these predictions, and then we're just looking for errors, for surprises. And when we find them, that's how we learn. It's super efficient. And in IntuiCell, it seems like they're using this same idea to build a system that can continuously learn.
And they've done some experiments that show this predictive capability, right?
Yep. Back in 2024, they showed off a small recurrent network that they trained, not in the traditional way, but just by exposing it to continuous random sensory input.
So like imagine you're touching something with your hand and you're getting all this sensory data from your skin. They kind of simulated that.
Yeah, exactly. And the cool thing is that this network, it learned to predict the sensory input. It built a model of the world, so to speak, completely on its own. And even more impressive, after it had done this learning, they gave it a new task, something it had never seen before, and it could actually do it.
Yeah.
It could solve this new problem. And then they simulated sensor damage, like some of the input was missing, and the network was still pretty resilient.
So even with incomplete information, it could still function. That's amazing. It really suggests that this continuous interaction with raw sensory data processed by a brain-like network, it can lead to some pretty powerful learning.
No question.
But, and there's always a but, they're still being kind of secretive about some of the really important details. Like they haven't fully explained their learning rules, the specifics of their network architecture.
Yeah, and that's understandable from a business perspective. They want to protect their intellectual property. But it also makes it harder for other researchers to really understand what you're doing
Ugh.
and evaluate their claims
So there's a bit of a trust us situation going on.
right now. Yeah. And it makes some people in the AI community a bit skeptical.
And even with Luna, I mean, they say it's learning without labeled data, without simulations. But there is a human trainer involved. It's not like Luna is just out there figuring everything out completely on its own.
That's true. There is that interaction with the human trainer.
Yeah.
So even though it's not the same as the huge data sets and all the pre-training that we see in traditional AI, that interaction is still providing some kind of feedback.
Hmm.
Maybe it's encouragement, maybe it's subtle physical cues. We don't know for sure, but it's definitely influencing how Luna learns.
So there are still some open questions about how much of the learning is truly autonomous, how much is driven by the interaction with the trainer. And one of the things that IntuiCell talks about is this idea of intrinsic sensory feedback. Basically, the system is trying to minimize surprises in its sensory input. So for Luna, if it's standing up, that means its sensor readings are more stable, and that could be a kind of reward. So it's learning to stand because that reduces the amount of unexpected fluctuations in its sensors.
Yeah, and that connects to something called control theory, where the idea is that a system can use feedback to maintain some desired state. So for Luna, the desired state is being upright, and it's using its sensors and its motors to constantly adjust and stay balanced.
Makes sense. But then how does the system balance that need for stability with exploring new things, trying out new movements? Like Luna has to move around, try different things to figure out what works.
That's a key question, and we don't have the full answer yet. It seems like Luna's random movements, those are its way of exploring right now. But whether that kind of random exploration is enough for more complex learning, that's something we'll have to see.
So digital nervous system, continuous autonomous learning, we're seeing some early signs that this approach might work, but there's still a lot more to be done, a lot more that we need to see to really be convinced.
I agree. Seeing Lena learn more things, seeing other robots or AI systems using the same software and learning new skills, that's going to be crucial.
Okay, let's talk about how they frame their technology. They're saying it's a fundamentally new paradigm and that it comes from 30 years of contrarian neuroscience research.
Yeah, and that really is at the core of their identity.
It's a pretty big claim.
It is. And a lot of it comes from the work of Professor Henrik Jerntel. He's at Lund University, and he's been studying sensor motor control, how our brains learn to move, for decades, literally decades.
And Intuos is basically trying to take all of his research, all of his insights about how brains work, and turn that into algorithms that can run on machines.
Exactly. And Professor Jerntel, he's not just some random neuroscientist. His lab has done tons of research on how brain circuits, especially the cerebellum and the cortex, how they use sensory feedback to learn new motor skills.
And their recent paper, A Foundational Theory for Decentralized Sensory Learning, that comes directly from all of this work, right?
Yeah, that paper lays out their thinking. And one of the key ideas there is that sensor motor learning, it's all about negative feedback control. Basically, neurons are trying to keep their sensory input within a certain range. They're adjusting themselves to maintain stability.
So instead of having one big error signal that's being used to correct everything, it's more like each neuron has its own little error signal that it's trying to minimize.
Yeah, it's a much more decentralized, self-organizing kind of approach. And this actually connects to a really cool theory in neuroscience called the free energy principle, which is all about minimizing surprise, minimizing prediction errors.
I've heard of that. It's like the brain is trying to build a model of the world, and it's always adjusting that model to reduce the amount of unexpected stuff that happens.
Exactly. And when you think about it, it makes a lot of sense from an evolutionary perspective. If an organism can predict what's going to happen, it's going to be better at surviving, right?
Yeah.
And IntuiCell is basically saying that this same principle can be applied to artificial intelligence.
It's like they're trying to give AI the same kind of survival instincts that we have.
In a way, yeah. And that's why they call it a new paradigm. It's a fundamentally different way of thinking about how AI should learn.
So they're not just trying to build a slightly better version of what we already have. They're trying to change the whole game.
Right, and it's a big challenge because brains are incredibly complex. I mean, even with all the research that we've done, we still don't fully understand how they work. But in IntuiCell, they seem to get that. They're not trying to oversimplify things.
Yeah, their plan to build a full digital nervous system, it shows that they're thinking about the different modules, the different parts of the brain, and how they all work together.
Exactly. They're starting with the spinal cord. They're working on the thalamocortex. It's like they're building a brain piece by piece.
And it's interesting to compare this to other attempts to use neuroscience to build AI. Like I remember reading about the Blue Brain Project, and that was a huge effort to simulate the brain in a lot of detail. But it didn't really lead to any breakthroughs in AI.
Yeah, and there have been other projects like that. And they've been valuable in terms of giving us more data about how the brain works. But they haven't really given us more intelligent machines.
And in IntuiCell, they're saying that they're doing something different. That Luna, their robot dog, is the first physical agent that's actually learning like a nervous system.
Right, and it's not just about mimicking the structure of the brain. It's about mimicking the learning process itself.
And their researcher, Dr. Udaya Rangala, he's actually said that their AI is an entirely new category of intelligence. It doesn't rely on brute force scaling, which is what a lot of AI today is all about. Just throw more data, more computing power at the problem.
Right, and that's a big part of why people are paying attention to IntuiCell. They're offering a different path. But of course, the big question is whether it will work.
And that's the thing. The theory is interesting. It's grounded in neuroscience. It makes sense. But we need to see more. We need to see if this paradigm can actually lead to AI that can do more than just stand up.
Definitely. And I think that's what everyone is waiting for. More results, more demonstrations.
Okay, so let's talk about this idea of having one neural architecture for many bodies. They're basically saying that their system is general purpose. You can put it in a robot dog, you can put it in a drone, you can put it in a virtual assistant, and it will learn how to function in that environment.
Yeah, and that's probably one of their most ambitious claims. They're saying that this digital nervous system, it's like a universal learning machine. You don't have to reprogram it. You don't have to retrain it. You just give it a body, give it some sensors and some actuators, and it figures out how to control them.
And they're talking about using it for all kinds of things. Humanoids, robots for exploring space, or the deep sea. Digital assistants that can actually learn and adapt to our needs. It's a huge range of applications.
It is. And the ultimate goal here, it's like building an artificial general intelligence, an AGI, but one that's specifically focused on control. So one system that can learn to do all sorts of things just by being embodied in different ways and learning from its interactions with the world.
It's kind of mind-blowing when you think about it.
Yeah, it is. And it goes against how we usually think about engineering. Like we tend to design things for a very specific purpose. But biology, it gives us this amazing example of a general purpose architecture, the brain. I mean, think about all the things that our brains can do. Walking, talking, thinking, solving problems. It's incredible.
And we only have one brain that does all of that.
Exactly. And IntuiCell is saying that they can build a system that has that same kind of flexibility. They're saying that if you build a system that's brain-like and give it the ability to continuously learn, it will specialize itself to whatever task it's given. It won't need us to reprogram it or retrain it for every new thing.
So it's like you could take the software that's running Luna, put it on a drone, and that drone would eventually learn to fly. Just from experience, just from interacting with the world.
That's the idea. The drone has different sensors, different motors. It's a completely different physical system than Luna. But the underlying learning rules, the algorithm, that would stay the same.
So it's like the drone's brain doesn't know it's a drone. It just knows that it has to figure out how to control these things that it's connected to.
Exactly. And that's the power of a general purpose system. But of course, there are still questions. Like even biological brains, they're not completely blank slates when we're born. We have certain instincts, certain predispositions that are shaped by evolution.
So maybe IntuiCell will have to build in some kind of biases or predispositions that are specific to certain types of agents. Like maybe the drone version of the software needs a little bit of extra help to figure out how to fly.
Yeah, it's possible. And when they say without reprogramming or retraining, what they probably mean is that the core code, the core algorithm, that stays the same. But each agent will still go through its own individual learning process.
It's still starting from scratch, in a way.
In a way, yeah. But it's not starting from zero. It's got this foundation, this architecture that's been designed to be general purpose. And this whole idea of continuous learning, It connects to some really interesting research in AI on things like meta learning and few-shot adaptation.
Yeah, I've heard those terms. It's like trying to build systems that can learn new things quickly with very little data.
Exactly. And you could think of IntuiCell's approach as a kind of lifelong meta-learning. The system is constantly adapting, constantly learning new things. And if they're right, if their learning rules are truly general, then the architecture itself doesn't need to know what kind of agent it's in. It just needs to figure out how to minimize surprise, how to act effectively in whatever situation it finds itself in.
That's a really cool idea, but it also makes me think about the practical side of things. Like, how long is it going to take for a new agent to learn something new? And what about safety? Like, what if the agent makes a mistake while it's learning? That could be a big problem, especially if we're talking about things like self-driving cars or robots working in factories.
Yeah, those are huge questions. And right now, we don't have a lot of answers. I mean, Luna is learning in a very controlled environment. There's a safety tether. There are researchers there to make sure nothing goes wrong. But in the real world, things are a lot messier. And if we're going to trust these systems to make decisions, we need to be really, really sure that they're not going to do something dangerous.
So there's a lot of work to be done before we see these general purpose AI systems out there in the wild. But it's an exciting prospect. The idea that we could have one system that can learn to do all sorts of things, it's incredibly powerful.
It is. And it's something that a lot of people are working on. But in IntuiCell, they seem to be taking a very different approach.
Yeah.
And it will be interesting to see how far they can push it.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the technology. Let's talk about the people behind IntuiCell. Who are they and what makes them credible?
All right, so IntuiCell, it was spun off from Lund University back in 2020. And since then, they've gotten a lot of funding from some pretty big names, like Navigar Ventures, Esna Ventures, even the European Union has given them money.
That's a good sign. It means that serious investors are looking at this and they're seeing something real.
Definitely. And Navigar Ventures, they specifically mentioned that they were excited about AI that can mimic the brain's plasticity. So they're buying into this whole idea of brain-inspired learning.
Makes sense. And the team itself, they seem to have the right mix of expertise.
Yeah, they do. So you've got Professor Henrik Jerntel. He's the co-founder and the principal scientist. He's the neuroscience guy. He's been doing this research for over 25 years. Then you've got Victor Luthman. He's the CEO. And he's got that engineering background, the business experience. Yeah. He's the one who's trying to turn the science into a product.
Right. So you need both. You need the science and you need someone who knows how to build a company.
Exactly. And then there's Linus Mortensen. He's the lead developer, so he's the software guy. Yeah. And he actually co-authored that foundational theory paper, so he's deeply involved in the science as well. Then you got Jonas Inander. He's another co-founder, and he's got a background in computational biology. He co-authored the paper too, so he brings that mathematical and computational expertise to the team. And then there's Dr. Udaya Rangala. He's the head of research, and he's a neuroscientist and an engineer. He's done a lot of work with Professor Jerntel on sensory-motor integration. So you've got this really solid team with experience in neuroscience, engineering, software development, mathematics. They've got all the bases covered.
It's a strong team. And they started out as part of an EU-funded project, and they're connected to other research labs and the Norsken House Startup Hub.
Yeah, so they're not just some isolated group working in a basement somewhere. They're part of the scientific community. They're part of the startup ecosystem. And that EU funding, that's a big deal. The EU, they tend to support research that's high risk, high reward. They're looking for things that could really change the world.
So it's not just about making money. It's about pushing the boundaries of what's possible.
Exactly. And all of this, it adds to their credibility. It shows that they're serious, that they're not just hyping something up. And the fact that they've already got Luna standing up, that's a tangible result. It's proof that they're actually making progress.
It's early days, but it's a good start. Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, what's our overall take on IntuiCell? How plausible are their claims?
I think it's fair to say that they're onto something interesting. Their approach, it's grounded in neuroscience. It's not just some made-up thing. And they've got the team, the expertise to try to make it work. Luna learning to stand up, that's evidence, even if it's just a small piece of evidence. And their research, their theoretical work, it provides a framework for understanding how this kind of learning might be possible.
And I think this is important, we have to be realistic. A robot dog learning to stand up, that's awesome, but it's a long way from a true paradigm shift in AI. It's a long way from machines that can learn like humans.
Absolutely. We should be excited, but we should also be cautious. Plausibility doesn't equal